On November 13, 2022, a quiet Sunday morning in Moscow, Idaho, became the day this small college town would never forget. In a single act of violence, 4 promising young lives were taken inside an off-campus home on King Road. The victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were not just students. They were friends, partners, and family to those around them. Their absence left a deep void in their community, their university, and in the hearts of the people who knew them best. Madison "Maddie" Mogen, 21, was a senior at the University of Idaho, majoring in marketing. Originally from Coeur d'Alene, she was a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority and worked part-time at a local restaurant called the Mad Greek. Maddie was known for her calm, reserved demeanor, a balance to her outgoing best friend, Kaylee Goncalves. The two were inseparable since 6th grade, bonded by years of shared milestones, inside jokes, and life goals. Her father, in one of the most difficult statements of his life, called her his only child, a simple phrase carrying the full weight of his loss. Kaylee Goncalves, also 21, shared nearly every chapter of her life with Maddie. She was majoring in general studies, a member of the Alpha Phi sorority, and had an infectious, energetic personality. Friends remembered her as the jokester of the group, someone who could turn any moment into a laugh. Ambitious and driven, she was on track to graduate early that December and had already secured a job with a tech company in Austin, Texas. Although she had moved out of the King Road house recently, she returned for the weekend to visit Maddie. It was a spontaneous decision made out of friendship, one that put her back in the house that night. As her father, Steve Goncalves, would later reflect, they came here together, they lived together, and they died together, in the same room, in the same bed. Xana Kernodle, 20, was a junior majoring in marketing, just like Maddie. She was also in Pi Beta Phi and worked at the same restaurant, further weaving their lives together. Originally from Arizona and later living in Post Falls, Idaho, Xana was known for her magnetic personality. Friends said she could strike up a conversation with anyone, and she had a keen taste in music that always seemed to set the right mood. At the time of her death, she was in a relationship with Ethan Chapin. Videos of the two laughing and singing along to country songs painted the picture of a young couple enjoying life together. Ethan Chapin, 20, was a sophomore majoring in recreation, sport, and tourism management. A member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, Ethan was from Mount Vernon, Washington, and was one of 3 siblings, triplets who all attended the University of Idaho. His relationship with Xana had started just months before, and that weekend he was staying over at her room on the 2nd floor of the King Road house. At a memorial service, his mother, Stacy, urged the community to hold their loved ones close and cherish every moment. These 4 individuals weren't random roommates or acquaintances. They formed a close social network. Maddie and Kaylee had the bond of a lifelong friendship. Maddie and Xana shared their sorority and their workplace. Xana and Ethan were in the early, joyful stages of a relationship. The house they shared wasn't just a rental, it was a place where their lives, routines, and friendships intertwined. The University of Idaho recognized this bond and the magnitude of the loss. In May 2023, all 4 were awarded posthumous degrees. It was a symbolic gesture to honor their academic achievements and the futures they were meant to have. Futures stolen in one night. This is where the story begins, not with the crime scene or the suspect, but with who they were. Because to understand the impact of what happened on King Road, you have to first see these 4 as more than names in a headline. They were part of each other's daily lives, bound together by friendship, love, and shared dreams. The night of Saturday, November 12, 2022, began like many others in Moscow, Idaho, a college town where weekends meant gatherings, late-night food runs, and the easy rhythms of student life. The King Road house, with its 3 levels and open layout, often hosted friends and saw a steady flow of people. That Saturday night was no different. until the early morning hours turned normalcy into horror. Around 8 to 9:12 p.m., Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, only a short walk from King Road. It was a night of music, conversation, and friends. At 1:45 a.m., Xana and Ethan returned to the King Road house. They entered through the sliding glass door, the same one friends often used. At 1:56 a.m., Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves arrived home. They had spent their night at the Corner Club, a sports bar in downtown Moscow, and later stopped at a local food truck before getting a ride home via a private car service. They too entered the house, heading upstairs to Maddie's room on the 3rd floor. By 2 a.m., all 4 victims and the 2 surviving roommates were inside the house. The night was winding down. Between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m., multiple calls were made from both Maddie A.S. and Kaylee S. phones to Kaylee S.'s former long-term boyfriend. None were answered. Then the house fell quiet, at least for a while. Around 4 a.m., a DoorDash delivery was made to Xana Kernodle. Investigators would later confirm the order was brought to her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Her phone records also show she was active on TikTok as late as 4:12 a.m., meaning she was awake in the minutes leading up to the attack. At roughly the same time, Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates, was awakened by noises. At first, she thought it might be Kaylee playing with her dog upstairs, but then she heard what sounded like Kaylee's voice saying, "There's someone here." Moments later, she heard crying from Xana's room and a man's voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." This was not help. A neighbor's security camera, located just under 50 feet from Xana's window, captured muffled whimpering, a loud thud, and the sound of a dog barking repeatedly around 4:17 a.m. Dylan opened her door for a 3rd time. Standing in the hallway was a man dressed in black, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. She later described him as about 5'10", or taller, with bushy eyebrows. He walked directly past her and toward the sliding glass door in the kitchen before leaving the house. Terrified, Dylan locked herself in her room. The entire attack took place in an estimated 25-minute window between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. Despite one victim being awake, and despite a direct encounter with a witness, the killer moved quickly through 2 floors of the house, leaving behind 4 victims. The discovery. It wasn't until 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours later, that a 911 call was placed from inside the home. The call reported an unconscious person. First responders arriving at the scene found a reality far worse. On the 3rd floor, Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were together in Maddie's bed. On the 2nd floor, Ethan Chapin was found in Xana's bed, while Xana was on the floor of her bedroom. All had been stabbed multiple times with a large military-style knife. There was no evidence they had been gagged or restrained. No signs of sexual assault. The violence was extreme. Xana had more than 50 stab wounds, many of them defensive, suggesting she fought desperately. Kaylee had over 20 stab wounds, along with blunt force injuries. The amount of blood was so significant that it was visible on the exterior wall of the house. The attack was over, but in its aftermath, a wave of fear and confusion spread far beyond King Road. The discovery of the crime scene at 1122 King Road stunned Moscow, Idaho. The town, home to just over 25,000 people, had not seen a murder since 2015. Now, it was the site of one of the most brutal cases in the state's history. The Moscow Police Department immediately launched an investigation, joined by the Idaho State Police and the FBI. From the start, the case drew intense public interest. But in those early days, official statements were limited and sometimes contradictory. Authorities initially said they believed the attack was targeted and that there was no ongoing risk to the community. Yet they also confirmed no suspect had been arrested. To residents, those two statements didn't align. Fear grew quickly, and many students left campus early for Thanksgiving break. Family members of the victims, particularly Steve Goncalves and Stacy Chapin, voiced frustration over the lack of updates. To them, silence felt like inaction. But behind the scenes, investigators were working methodically. Law enforcement knew the scale of public interest and the danger of revealing too much. Every detail released could be a signal to the suspect, so they absorbed criticism, choosing to protect the integrity of the case over satisfying the public's demand for answers. The first major public lead came December 7, 2022. Police announced they were looking for a white 2011-2016 Hyundai Elantra seen near the victim's home around the time of the murders. Surveillance footage captured the car making multiple passes by the house between 3:29 a.m. and 4:04 a.m. before speeding away at approximately 4:20 a.m. This announcement brought in thousands of tips, and while the public was only just learning about the car, investigators had already been tracking it. On December 15th, during a cross-country drive from Washington to Pennsylvania for the holidays, Bryan Kohberger was pulled over twice in Indiana for minor traffic violations. He was driving a white Hyundai Elantra with his father in the passenger seat. Both stops were brief, and the officers let them go. At the time, the public had no idea who he was, but federal investigators likely already knew they were watching their prime suspect. 2 weeks later, the investigation reached its turning point. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 2022, an FBI tactical team surrounded the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. They moved in quickly and arrested Bryan Christopher Kohberger on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The arrest came 47 days after the murders. It was the result of a careful mix of forensic science, digital tracking, and traditional police work. What shocked many was who the suspect turned out to be: a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just 8 miles from the crime scene. Kohberger wasn't some distant stranger. He was a man studying the very systems designed to catch people like him. His arrest brought a measure of relief to Moscow, but it also deepened the intrigue. How had someone with such academic knowledge of crime left enough behind for police to track him? That answer would come in the evidence. When Bryan Christopher Kohberger's name was released, it was met with disbelief. This wasn't a drifter or someone with no connection to the area. He was a 28-year-old PhD student in criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, just a short drive from Moscow, Idaho. For years, Kohberger had been deeply immersed in the academic study of criminal behavior. He held an Associate S degree in psychology and both a Bachelor S and a Master S degree in criminal justice from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. At DeSales, he studied under Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist known for her expertise on serial killers. Kohberger had written research papers on crime scene processing and even conducted surveys asking criminals about their thoughts and emotions during offenses. In August 2022, he moved across the country to begin his doctoral studies at WSU. He also worked as a teaching assistant, grading papers and leading classes. In a detail that would later disturb investigators, Kohberger had applied for an internship with the Pullman Police Department, saying he wanted to help rural law enforcement agencies analyze and collect data. On the surface, it was a profile of someone dedicated to the field of criminology. But beneath that, troubling patterns began to emerge. Former classmates from high school and college described Kohberger as socially awkward and sometimes aggressive. In high school, after losing a significant amount of weight, he reportedly became more confrontational. In his late teens, he developed a heroin addiction, which he eventually overcame. At WSU, his interactions with women were concerning enough that faculty met with him about his behavior. His position as a teaching assistant was ultimately terminated on December 19, 2022, just days before his arrest. While his academic background might have given him the tools to plan a crime, it also fostered what investigators believe was a fatal overconfidence. Kohberger appeared to believe he could commit the murders and outsmart law enforcement. But his mistakes told a different story. The most significant was the knife sheath left at the scene, found on Madison Mogen's bed. It was for a K-bar military-style knife, and the snap button on the sheath held a single source of male DNA, Kohberger's. His digital footprint also worked against him. Cell phone records showed his phone had been near the King Road house at least 12 times in the months before the murders, almost always late at night. On the night of the killings, his phone went dark at 2:47 a.m., likely turned off to avoid detection, and reconnected at 4:48 a.m., well after the murders. Even more incriminating, his phone was back in the vicinity of the house around 9 a.m. the next morning. Then there was his car. The white Hyundai Elantra, seen on multiple security cameras, matched his vehicle. Investigators traced it directly to him, linking his movements on the night of the murders to the crime scene. In the weeks following the attack, Kohberger took steps to clean his car and apartment, likely trying to remove evidence. But investigators were already building their case. The portrait that emerged was chilling, a man who combined academic knowledge of crime with a willingness to commit it, believing he could navigate around the very systems he studied. In reality, his arrogance and missteps gave investigators the trail they needed. The case against Kohberger. Once Bryan Kohberger was in custody, the focus shifted to the evidence that would connect him to the murders beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution, led by Latah County Prosecutor Bill Thompson, built its case on three main pillars: DNA evidence, digital tracking, and visual confirmation. DNA evidence. The most powerful link between Kohberger and the crime was the DNA found on the K-bar knife sheath left at the scene. The snap button contained a single source of male DNA. Investigators turned to investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that compares unknown DNA to profiles in public genealogy databases to identify potential relatives. This search led them to distant relatives of Kohberger, and from there, they built a family tree pointing toward him. To confirm the match, agents conducted a trash pull outside his parents' home in Pennsylvania on December 27, 2022. They recovered DNA from a discarded Q-tip that matched the sheath sample with a high probability of being his father. After the arrest, a direct cheek swab from Kohberger confirmed a near-perfect match to the DNA on the sheath. This piece of evidence was considered the smoking gun of the case. Digital footprint investigators traced Kohberger's movements through cell phone tower data. His phone had connected to towers near the King Road house at least 12 times before the murders, most often late at night. This suggested he had been surveilling the home. On the night of the murders, his phone was switched off or disconnected from the network from 2:47 a.m. to 4:48 a.m., covering the period of the killings. At 4:48 a.m., his phone reconnected south of Moscow. Then, at approximately 9 a.m., his phone returned to the vicinity of the crime scene, a move investigators saw as consistent with offenders returning to observe their work. Visual and eyewitness confirmation. Surveillance cameras captured a white Hyundai Elantra, registered to Kohberger, circling the area multiple times before the attack and speeding away after 4:20 a.m. The surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, also gave a description of the intruder: tall, dressed in black, wearing a mask, and with bushy eyebrows. While she did not identify Kohberger directly, her account was consistent with his physical appearance. The defense strategy. Kohberger's attorneys, led by Ann Taylor, focused on creating reasonable doubt by attacking the methods of the investigation rather than the evidence itself. Their main target was the use of investigative genetic genealogy. They argued that this technique amounted to an unconstitutional search of Kohberger's genetic information without a warrant. If they could have that initial search ruled illegal, they could argue that all subsequent evidence, the DNA swab, search warrants, and even vehicle tracking, was inadmissible as fruit of the poisonous tree. The defense also floated the idea that Kohberger's DNA could have been planted at the scene. They pointed to other unidentified male DNA samples recovered at the house that prosecutors said were not eligible for database comparison. For an alibi, they claimed that Kohberger had been on one of his frequent late-night drives miles away from the crime scene. The stakes. This was always going to be a high-profile, high-stakes case. In June 2023, the prosecution announced it would seek the death penalty, citing the extreme and heinous nature of the crime. This raised the pressure on both sides, especially for the defense, whose primary goal now became keeping their client alive. The case was not only about proving guilt, it was about ensuring that the evidence and the way it was obtained would stand up to appeals and scrutiny for years to come. For the families of the victims, each new filing and motion delayed answers and prolonged the emotional strain. From arrest to conviction. After Bryan Kohberger's arrest in December 2022, the legal process unfolded under intense national attention. His extradition from Pennsylvania to Idaho was swift. He waived the right to a hearing and was returned to Latah County within days. At his first court appearance, Kohberger stood silent when asked for his plea. Under Idaho law, this prompted the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. From that point on, the case moved into a complex pre-trial phase defined by strict information control. A sweeping gag order was issued early in the proceedings, preventing attorneys, investigators, and other officials from speaking publicly about the case. The move was aimed at preserving the fairness of the trial in light of the massive online speculation and media coverage that had already saturated the community. Change of venue. One of the defense's key early wins came when they convinced the court that a fair jury trial in Latah County would be impossible. They argued that the combination of small-town familiarity and wall-to-wall media coverage had created an environment where bias was unavoidable. The judge agreed, moving the trial to Ada County, home to Boise, hundreds of miles from Moscow. The death penalty factor. On June 26, 2023, prosecutors formally announced their intent to seek the death penalty. They cited the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the killings and the multiple victims as qualifying factors under Idaho law. This raised the stakes significantly, not just for Kohberger, but for both legal teams. For the prosecution, a death penalty case meant a higher burden of proof, extensive jury selection, and the potential for appeals to drag on for years. For the defense, it meant that avoiding execution would now become their central goal. Negotiations and the plea deal. By mid-2025, both sides understood the risks. The prosecution had a strong case, but there were legal gray areas, particularly around the use of investigative genetic genealogy, that could become grounds for appeal if a death sentence was imposed. The defense, aware that the mountain of evidence would be difficult to overcome at trial, opened discussions on a possible plea deal. The offer: Kohberger would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. On July 2, 2025, Kohberger appeared in court and formally entered guilty pleas to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. He did not provide a statement explaining his actions, nor did he answer the lingering question of motive. Sentencing. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, the courtroom was filled with family members, survivors, and members of the public. Judge Stephen Hippler sentenced Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. Before the sentence was handed down, the court heard victim impact statements. Parents, siblings, and friends spoke about the lives lost, the dreams cut short, and the pain that would never truly fade. For the first time, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, the surviving roommates, spoke publicly about that night, describing the fear, the confusion, and the lasting trauma of being in the house during the murders. Throughout the statements, Kohberger sat expressionless. When given the chance to speak, he declined. A divided response. For some families, the plea deal brought relief. It guaranteed that Kohberger would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of release. For others, particularly the Goncalves family, it was a bitter outcome. They had hoped for a full public trial where all the evidence could be presented and the why might finally be answered. In the end, the plea deal reflected a legal compromise: absolute certainty of conviction and lifetime imprisonment in exchange for forfeiting the opportunity to confront him in a courtroom battle. It closed the legal chapter, but left an emotional one still open: the digital firestorm. The University of Idaho murders unfolded in the glare of 21st century technology. Within hours of the crime being reported, social media became an unofficial and often unreliable second investigation. When Moscow police announced early in the case that details would be limited to protect the investigation, an information vacuum formed. That space was quickly filled by online communities eager to analyze every scrap of public data. On TikTok, the hashtag #OurIdahoMurders would rack up more than 94 million views in just weeks. Reddit threads stretched into the thousands of comments, and Facebook groups dedicated to the case swelled to tens of thousands of members. YouTube channels produced hour-long analyses of security camera footage, interviews, and body language breakdowns of people connected to the victims. But the rapid spread of theories came with a dangerous side effect: misinformation and false accusations. Innocent people were targeted. Friends seen with the victims in public videos were accused of involvement. Kaylee Goncalves' ex-boyfriend, who received multiple unanswered calls from her and Maddie that night, faced intense online harassment before police publicly cleared him. A man named Adam, mentioned on a live stream, was relentlessly speculated about, despite there being no evidence he was involved. The two surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, became central figures in online debates. The fact that 8 hours passed between the murders and the 911 call was twisted into baseless claims that they knew more than they were saying. Some users went as far as sending them death threats. Law enforcement had to release a public statement confirming they were not suspects. The Papa Roger. Theory: one of the more bizarre online threads revolved around a Facebook user with the handle Papa Roger. This account made unusually detailed comments about the murders, at one point mentioning a knife sheath before that detail was made public. The profile photo resembled Bryan Kohberger, and the account went silent after his arrest. Many speculated it had been him posting, though no official confirmation has been made. Law enforcement pushback. The sheer volume of speculation forced investigators to adapt. They issued targeted press releases to correct false rumors and, in some cases, to protect the safety of those wrongly accused. The court responded by issuing one of the broadest gag orders in recent memory, limiting statements from both the prosecution and defense. When the trial venue was moved to Boise, part of the justification was the fear that local jurors had already been influenced by online narratives. It was a striking example of how digital commentary can seep into the real legal process. A double-edged sword. The Idaho case demonstrated the double-edged nature of online involvement in criminal cases. On one hand, social media can help keep public attention on a case, potentially surfacing new leads. On the other, the lack of editorial oversight means false information can spread unchecked, damaging reputations and even affecting the ability to hold a fair trial. For the families of the victims, the constant online chatter was a mixed experience. Some used it as a way to share memories of their loved ones and keep pressure on for justice. Others saw it as a relentless reminder of their loss, one that often distorted the truth. This case has become a cautionary example for law enforcement and legal experts. In the digital era, the courtroom is no longer the only stage for a high-profile case. Public opinion can be shaped and sometimes misled long before a verdict is reached. The motive mystery. Even with Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea and life sentence, one question continues to haunt the families, investigators, and the public. Why? The case was unusual in that the resolution came without a trial. Kohberger never offered a confession or explanation, and the plea deal removed the opportunity for prosecutors to present a full narrative in court. That silence has left a void, one that has been filled by evidence-based theories, each attempting to explain what could have driven such calculated brutality. Theory 1. Misogynistic rage and the incel connection. One widely discussed theory connects Kohberger to the online incel subculture, short for involuntary celibate. This community, largely male, often expresses deep resentment toward women, sometimes romanticizing acts of violence against them. There are circumstantial clues that suggest a possible link. Online sleuths pointed to the username Papa Roger in case discussion groups, speculating that it could reference Elliot Rodger, the perpetrator of the 2014 Isla Vista killings who targeted women in a sorority house. Kohberger reportedly showed a strong interest in the Rodger case during his academic studies. The victims' demographics also fuel this theory. 3 of the 4 were women, and the level of violence inflicted on them, especially Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves, was extreme. Some interpret this as evidence of targeted rage toward women. Theory 2. The perfect crime experiment. Kohberger's academic path adds weight to another theory, that he was attempting to execute what he believed would be the perfect crime. As a criminology PhD student, he studied criminal profiling, crime scene analysis, and investigative procedures. His actions on the night of the murders, turning off his phone, wearing a mask, cleaning his car, suggest an effort to avoid leaving evidence. Some criminologists believe he may have seen the murders as a way to test his knowledge, outsmart investigators, and gain a sense of intellectual superiority. But his mistakes, the left-behind knife sheath, phone records, and vehicle sightings, show that theory collided with reality. Theory 3. A specific target. From the earliest stages of the investigation, police described the attack as targeted, though they never clarified whether the target was the house or someone inside. Friends of Kaylee Goncalves said she had mentioned feeling like she had a stalker in the weeks before the murders. While police were unable to verify that claim, her and Maddie's third-floor bedroom was the scene of extreme violence. Kohberger's phone was also near the house at least a dozen times in the months before the murders, often late at night, behavior that could indicate stalking. If there was a primary target, it's possible the other victims were killed because they were present, turning the crime into a chain of escalating violence. The silence as control. By not explaining himself, Kohberger maintains a measure of control over the narrative. For the families, this silence is its own kind of cruelty. It withholds closure and ensures the case will remain a subject of speculation. For investigators and legal experts, the unanswered why is a reminder that even with modern forensic science, some truths can remain out of reach. Motive may not change the verdict, but it shapes how the public and the victims' loved ones make sense of the tragedy. In the end, the King Road killings are defined by both certainty and mystery. The certainty of who committed them and the mystery of why. The aftermath and legacy. The King Road murders left deep scars, not only for the families and friends of the victims, but for the entire Moscow community. The University of Idaho, known for its close-knit campus culture, faced a reality where safety could no longer be taken for granted. Impact on the university. In the months following the murders, the University of Idaho increased campus security measures. Additional surveillance cameras, improved lighting, and expanded late-night transportation services were implemented. Counseling and mental health services were made more accessible for students and staff, many of whom were struggling with grief, fear, and anxiety. The university also worked to honor the victims in meaningful ways. In May 2023, posthumous degrees were awarded to Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Memorial scholarships in their names were established to help future students, an attempt to ensure that their legacies would inspire others, even in the face of tragedy. Changes in the Moscow community. For the people of Moscow, the sense of safety that comes from living in a small town was shaken. Residents began locking doors more consistently, installing home security systems, and remaining more alert in their daily routines. Local businesses, particularly those the victims had worked at or frequented, became informal memorial spaces. The Mad Greek restaurant, where both Maddie and Xana had been employees, displayed photos of the two women alongside flowers and handwritten notes from community members. Lessons for law enforcement. From a law enforcement perspective, the case highlighted both the strengths and challenges of modern criminal investigations in the age of social media. The decision to withhold certain details, like the existence of the knife sheath, proved critical in avoiding tipping off the suspect. However, it also allowed misinformation to spread rapidly online, creating public tension. The case reinforced the value of investigative genetic genealogy as a tool for solving complex crimes. But it also sparked legal debates about privacy and constitutional rights, debates that could shape how the technique is used in future cases. True crime in the digital age. For the broader true crime community, the Idaho murders became a case study in the influence and danger of online speculation. Amateur investigations can bring fresh perspectives, but without verification, they can also cause harm to innocent people and complicate official investigations. The judge's sweeping gag order and the eventual change of trial venue were both, in part, responses to the overwhelming online presence of the case. This dynamic between public access to information and the need for an impartial judicial process is likely to become more common in high-profile crimes. The family's ongoing grief. While the legal chapter has closed, the emotional journey for the families continues. For some, the guilty plea was enough. An end to the uncertainty and the start of a life sentence without parole for the man responsible. For others, it felt incomplete. Without a trial, they may never fully understand what led to that night. Kaylee Goncalves' family, in particular, expressed frustration over the plea deal, feeling it denied them the chance to see every piece of evidence and hear the full story in court. They have vowed to continue speaking publicly about the case and advocating for victims' rights. A lasting legacy. The King Road killings have joined a small group of modern American crimes that will be remembered for decades, not just for their brutality, but for the way they unfolded in the public eye. The victims are remembered not as case numbers, but as individuals. Maddie's quiet strength, Kaylee's infectious energy, Xana's warmth, and Ethan's easygoing nature. In a way, the public's collective memory has preserved them as more than just victims. Their story has also become a touchstone for conversations about campus safety, forensic technology, and the ethics of online investigation. The case showed both the progress made in solving crimes and the limits of what even the most advanced techniques can answer. Closing reflections. The murders on King Road will forever mark a dark chapter in Moscow, Idaho's history. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the grief is permanent. For their friends, classmates, and community, the loss is a constant reminder of how quickly life can change. The case is unusual in that the ending is both definitive and incomplete. The identity of the killer is no longer in doubt. Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea ensures that. His sentence of 4 consecutive life terms without parole means he will never walk free again. Yet the central question, why, remains unanswered. That void in the narrative is what will keep this case in public conversation for years to come. Justice without full answers. For prosecutors, the plea deal was a practical decision. It removed the risk of appeals that could overturn a death sentence and spared the families a lengthy, emotionally draining trial. For some relatives, that certainty brought closure. For others, it left them feeling as though the story ended without resolution. In high-profile crimes, the public often assumes that every case ends with a complete account, motive, method, and outcome neatly tied together. The reality is more complicated. Some questions remain beyond the reach of evidence, locked away in the mind of the person who committed the act. Kohberger's silence has ensured that his reasons, whether rooted in ideology, obsession, or personal grievance, are his alone. The broader impact beyond Moscow, the case has influenced law enforcement strategies, particularly in how agencies manage public information during active investigations. It has also fueled debate over the use of advanced forensic techniques, like investigative genetic genealogy. Supporters see it as an indispensable tool for catching dangerous offenders. Critics warn about the potential for privacy violations. For universities and campus communities, the case has served as a call to re-examine safety measures, especially for off-campus housing. The King Road House, once a home filled with student life, was eventually vacated and later demolished, both to protect the privacy of the families and to prevent it from becoming a grim tourist attraction. Lessons for the true crime era. The Idaho murders also stand as a warning about the power and the pitfalls of social media in criminal cases. Online attention can help keep pressure on authorities and generate leads, but it can also create a parallel investigation that spreads misinformation and damages lives. This case illustrated how quickly public speculation can spiral into personal attacks on innocent people. It also demonstrated that digital narratives can influence real-world legal proceedings, from gag orders to venue changes. Remembering the victims. As much as the case is about forensic evidence, police work, and court strategy, it is also about 4 young people whose lives were cut short. Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan were students with ambitions, friends with shared jokes, and family members whose absence is felt daily. The scholarships and memorials in their names ensure they are remembered for the lives they lived, not only for the way those lives ended. A case that will endure. Some crimes fade from public memory once the verdict is delivered. Others, like the King Road killings, remain part of the cultural record. The combination of brutality, mystery, and the digital age's relentless documentation has cemented it as one of the most discussed cases of the 2020s. In the end, this story is a mix of resolution and uncertainty. Justice served, but not fully explained. For the people of Moscow, the University of Idaho, and those who followed the investigation from afar, it's a reminder of both the strengths and the limits of our justice system. And for the families, the story will never truly be over.